Um, Welcome tonight. It is really difficult to be fair to this incredible biography. So it's just a few keywords I mention. You should go into Wikipedia and study several pages of this very impressive career behind this man, Philippe Sands. If you look for one word to describe his commitment to international law, to publicity of justice, you would probably call him, with a French word, engagé. It's always committed for justice. And I guess you have seen this book, which is not the topic of tonight. It's a biography, and in a way, you probably are aware of Nicholas Frank and his debate or discussion of his father's responsibility or whatever he did under the Nazis. Now you have a comparison with Horst von Wächter, who is the son of Otto Wächter, who is in charge of the persecution and killing, a mass murder of Galicia. But today, the issue is international law in context of colonialism and the weird practice, post-war world situation, how to treat people in international law, to deport and question their legal rights in an international law context. Now, as I said, he's an engaging lawyer. He was professor trained in Cambridge and Harvard, a professor at the London College of London, UCL, and various guest professorships in all major contexts, universities we can imagine. But he's also a writer, and these documentaries, some of you may have seen films where the script was his, and you probably read articles in all major known and important magazines. So I wonder whether 24 hours are actually enough, what you do. And we were just talking about possible new projects. That's a lifetime for many of us, what lies ahead in the next few years. So welcome with me, Professor Philippe Sands, author of great books. Welcome to Heidelberg.
I'm going to stand because I think that's just more comfortable. And also, as a barrister, that's what we do. I'm also a practicing litigating lawyer. I haven't really been given a script about what I'm to talk about tonight. Or indeed, Jacob, you haven't even told me how long I should talk for, whether I should imitate Fidel Castro and speak for 7.5 hours, or prefer to do something short and then actually have a conversation, is it the tradition here for there to be questions and conversation? Excellent. If there will be many questions left. So let's start at the end, in a sense, just to give you a hint about what this latest book is about. This latest book is a sort of interregnum. It is called in English The Last Colony, in German Die letzte Kolonie. It was published here just a few weeks ago. And it is a different kind of story from Rückkehr nach Lemberg and Die Rattenlinie, because it tells a story about a British crime. And one of the things that I've learned in publishing this book that's been extremely interesting for me is that when you publish a book about German crimes or Nazism in the United Kingdom, everybody wants to talk to you. Every radio show, every newspaper, every television program. When you write a book about a British act of wrongdoing, the interest doesn't disappear, but it diminishes very greatly. And I've come to understand, this book just came out a few months ago in Britain in September. It comes out in paperback this week, that Germany occupies a very special place these days for the United Kingdom. The crimes of 75 years ago allow the British to feel better about themselves, because they are able to say to themselves, look, there's someone over there who's done something that is even worse than what we did. I hadn't fully appreciated this. So a quick word about what this book is about, and then let's go backwards to the bigger themes. 13 years ago, in April 2010, in the very same month that I received an invitation to visit the city of Lemberg for the first time, and that then caused me to write Rückkehr nach Lemberg, I received a phone call while I was on a skiing holiday with my brother in France. I was actually on a chairlift, and my practice, given my levels of anxiety and dropping my telephone from a great height, is not to answer telephones while I'm sitting on a chairlift. But the number was curious. It was +230, which was not a number that I knew. So I answered the phone whilst on the chairlift, and it was the office of the Prime Minister of a small African country called Mauritius. Just out of interest, who here has heard of Mauritius? Okay, so a few of you have heard of Mauritius. Great, okay. So Mauritius is in the Indian Ocean. It was, until 1814, a colony of France. It was actually called Île-de-France. And then in 1814, by the Treaty of Paris, it was ceded to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and it became the British colony of Mauritius. And so it remained until the 1960s. By then, the world had changed, and as many of you in this room will know, the United Nations Charter had proclaimed an end to colonial rule, the right to self-determination for people under colonial rule, and independence for colonized countries. In Mauritius, the people decided that they wanted independence. There's about 1 million people in Mauritius. And so they began to agitate for independence. In the mid-1960s, the British said, okay, we hear you, we will be willing to consider independence, but we have a demand to make in return. And that demand in return is that Mauritius includes an archipelago called the Chagos-Archipelago, Chagos. It's about 1,000 miles, 1,500 kilometers from Mauritius, in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And we would like to keep the Chagos Archipelago because the Americans have identified one of the 58 islands, Diego Garcia, as an island on which they would like to place a military base. So we will give you your independence, and in return, you will let us keep the whole of the Chagos Archipelago, 640,000 square kilometers of ocean and 58 tiny islands. Now, if you go back to 1965, this was not a sort of level playing field in terms of negotiating power. The Mauritians were summoned to London. They met with Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, and Harold Wilson had in his possession a briefing note which instructed him on how to deal with the Mauritians. And the briefing note said, Prime Minister, your job is to frighten them with hope. Hope that they will get independence, and fear that they will not if they do not accept our request to keep the Chagos Archipelago. And under those conditions, which some might call duress, the leadership of Mauritius agreed. Independence in return for the United Kingdom keeping the Chagos Archipelago, which the British would then rename the British Indian Ocean Territory, BIOT. That was the deal, so to speak, in 1965. Mauritius got independence in 1968. The British created their last colony ever, the British Indian Ocean Territory, hence the title. And between 1968 and 1973, the British government forcibly deported every single person living on the Chagos Archipelago. It's about 2,000 human beings who'd lived there for many generations, all black, all descended from enslaved people. And they removed them to Mauritius, Seychelles, and a small number to the United Kingdom. It was a forcible deportation. That was the situation as of 1973, and that situation remained until April 2010, when the Prime Minister of Mauritius called me while I was on a ski lift in France with my brother. Mr. Sands, he said, will you help us to recover our islands that were taken from us illegally? And for the last 14 years, I have been working on that case. The call came from him, and for 14 years I've been working for Mauritius. Now, one of the things about the United Kingdom that is very interesting is that unlike pretty much every other country in the world, it's not a problem to be British and to be acting against your own country. In fact, as an English barrister, I am independent, and my independence is absolutely protected by statute. And I've never had a moment's difficulty that I've been acting against the United Kingdom. In fact, I'm also a French national. In 1995, I acted against France at the International Court of Justice, expressing my independence of spirit as a barrister, an advocate, a litigator. And to this day, 28 years later, the Quai d'Orsay has not forgiven me, a French national, for acting against the interests of France. So we can talk about this later and the relationship that an individual human being has with their own country. And the book, The Last Colony, tells the story of the effort to recover the islands for Mauritius. But for those of you who've read my other books, you will know that what appears to be a dry, turgid, uninteresting, rather dull subject actually can be made to be extraordinarily interesting if it's told in the right way. I'm not saying that I've done that, but I've tried to do that in the same style as East-West Street, Rücken nach Lemberg, and the Ratline, Die Ratten, Linear. And the way that I've done it in relation to this book is to take a single, remarkable human being and make her the center of the entire story. Her name is Lisby Elise. She was born in 1953. She cannot read and she cannot write. She's a person of immense dignity and intelligence and courage and humour, and I've come to know her very, very well. When in 2017, the General Assembly of the United Nations voted to override the objections of Britain and the United States, quite an achievement, African country, population 1 million, taking on the UK and the US, the General Assembly voted to send the question of Chagos to the World Court in The Hague. And so we had to decide, we have now a case at the World Court, we're going to have legal arguments, we're going to have hearings. How do we make this argument resonate? And I was the lead lawyer on the team, and I've come to understand that when you're litigating a case, of course, you deal with the facts, of course, you deal with the law, but it's also a form of storytelling. It's also a way of speaking to 15 judges to get them to understand this is not an arcane, technical, dull legal issue. This is about real people with real lives who want to go back to the place that they were removed from. And so we decided very early on that we would make sure that since the Chagosians, as they are called, had not had their voice listened to in 1965, finding ourselves before the International Court of Justice, it was imperative that their voice must be heard before the court. And so we went about the exercise of identifying one or more Chagosians who could speak to the court in their own voice. Not through the lawyers, not through the government, but just say what had happened to them. And so Lisby Elise was one of the 6 or 7 Chagosians who we met, who had been already adult enough to understand what was happening in 1973 when she was forcibly removed. I remember meeting her for the first time and her telling me the story of what had happened. She was on her small island, Perros Banhos, where she had been born 20 years earlier. She was newly married. She was pregnant. She said, "On avait bon la vie," they speak Creole. We have a great life here. And I saw something on my island on the 28th of April, 1973, which I'd never seen before. I saw a white person. And this white person came up to me and said, "Madam, tomorrow you will leave this island. And you will leave this island with one suitcase." Now, those of you who've read East-West Street will understand that when those words are spoken to me, they're going to resonate. The first thing that came into my mind was my 2 great-grandmothers, who of course I never knew, who were 2 elderly ladies in Vienna in July 1942, who were told exactly the same thing. You will leave tomorrow and you will take one suitcase. And here I was presented, this time not with a Viennese Jewish lady of a certain age in Vienna, but with a black lady of the same age now as my great-grandmothers were then, basically telling me exactly the same story. Except in this case, it was the British who were forcibly removing her, not sending her to a death camp, not sending her to be exterminated, thankfully, although the dogs that they had, they're very partial to dogs. It's a very religious community, deeply Roman Catholic. The dogs were all gassed. And to this day, 50 years later, they are incredibly distressed by the gassing of the dogs. And we selected in the end Lisby Elise to be the witness before the International Court of Justice. And the book tells the story of how these cases actually work at the International Court of Justice. Just to pause for a moment, for those of you who've read my other books, you will know, in particularly from The Rat Line, where he features as a character. I've had many privileges in life and many good fortunes, but one of the very greatest good fortunes that I've had is for 20 years to have been the next-door neighbour of the writer John le Carré. He was someone I would have lunch with in the local pub once a month. We came to know each other very well. He died a couple of years ago, as you know. And once we had gotten to know each other, he would say, could I share my manuscript with you to comment on one item? Those of you who have read John le Carré will know that every John le Carré novel has one truly disgusting lawyer in the story. And my job was to make sure that the disgusting lawyer spoke like a lawyer, looked like a lawyer, sounded like a lawyer, acted like a lawyer. We'd have the most fantastic conversations. He would turn up at the front door, he would just ring on the doorbell, and he'd be standing there with his manuscript, 400 pages, printed at home on his home computer, and he would just say, usual procedure, please. Usual procedure, his real name's David Cornwall. And my job was to go through the whole 400 pages. The problem was that he didn't put a little sticky in it and say, the lawyer's at page 195 or 327. So I had to read the entire thing, which of course was not a burden. I loved reading those books. The books are fantastic. But I learnt the tricks that he uses. I learnt how to take the dry stuff of daily life. I'm not saying I'm John le Carré, I'm not saying I do it like he does it, but I learnt, and we talked a lot about how he did it. It's fascinating. It's totally fascinating how you take a really dry subject and make people want to continue to read. And his golden rules are really interesting. The first golden rule of John le Carré was readers are really intelligent. Treat them with respect. They are reading, he explained to me, in a double function. There's one part of their brain that is just reading what you have written to understand the story that you're telling. And there's another part of the brain that is trying to be more clever than the writer and to work out ahead of the writer where the story is going. The moment you think about this, you'll see that he's completely right. And he said, as his second golden rule, once readers read you regularly, they know that every word you put, particularly in the early parts of the book, is there for a reason. And they are trying to work out why you wrote that thing, that line, at that point of the story. That is why, for example, for those of you who've read Die Rattenlinie, Jacob was very generous about it, you'll have noticed that very early on in the rat line, I mention how much Otto Wächter loved to swim. And that is there for a very important reason. And those who've read my books have now come to understand why, stealing entirely from John le Carré, David Cornwall, I've used the same technique. And it's that technique that makes people want to carry on reading. And so the miracle for me with The Last Colony, with The Rat Line, and with Rückkehr nach Lemberg is not that readers are very smart, they are, but they are interested in legal ideas and principles and court cases and challenges and difficulties. And if you put it into a human context, they will really immerse themselves into these stories. And so to step back slightly from The Last Colony, and I'm not going to spoil for those who haven't read it what happens, but ultimately it was an immensely positive and satisfying outcome for Lisbeth-Élysée, for the Chagosians, for Mauritius, and for the idea of international justice. The bigger project that I've been engaged in, which is very resonant with this institution, is the significance of the 1945 moment. That something fundamental happened in 1945. Until 1945, and this is in essence the story I tell in East West Street, the state, the sovereign, the Führer, the emperor, the king, the queen, was entirely free to treat the people of the country that person ruled as they wanted under international law. I'm not talking about domestic law, that's different. But as a matter of international law, if a country decided, right, I'm going to divide this room in half, and at 1800 hours tomorrow, everyone on this side of the room is going to be put to death, international law had nothing to say about it. You could do it. States were entirely free to kill their own people, as individuals or as members of the group. And so the revolution that happened in 1945, with the Charter of the United Nations and with the Statute of the Nuremberg Tribunal, was the idea that the power of the state is no longer absolute. The individual has rights, and as members of a group, human beings have rights. These were the two fundamental ideas in Rückkehr nach Lemberg, East-West Street, the invention of two concepts in international law: crimes against humanity and genocide. Crimes against humanity, which was put into the Charter and Statute of the Nuremberg Tribunal as one of the crimes, essentially is about the protection of individuals. You cannot systematically and with widespread effect abuse, kill, torture, harm large numbers of individuals. But it essentially puts the accent on the protection of the individual. It was put into the Charter of Nuremberg, into the Statute of Nuremberg, by a professor at Cambridge University, Hirsch Lauterpacht, who persuaded the prosecutor of the Nuremberg Tribunal, Robert Jackson, to include it. And it was drawn from his own work and a book he had just published on a Bill of International Rights of Man. In parallel with the work of Hirsch Lauterpacht was the work of Raphael Lemkin, who in November 1944 invented the concept of genocide. Unlike Lauterpacht, who focused on the protection of individuals, Lemkin had another theory. Lemkin's theory was human beings don't get harmed because of what they've done as individual human beings. They get harmed because they're a member of a group that is hated at a particular moment in time and place. So if you want to protect those humans, don't protect their individual rights, protect them by their membership of the group. And hence genocide is about the protection of groups, and it criminalizes the destruction of certain groups. And you have these two ideas going hand in hand. And this is the story that I told in East-West Street. What's remarkable about the story that I discovered, I'm not saying the telling of the story, is that the origins of these two men and these two crimes is traced to a single city, which is back in the news today. The city of Lemberg, Lviv, Lvov, Leopolis, Lvov, today part of Western Ukraine. They both studied at the same law faculty in the same city, not at exactly the same time. They went on to have different lives. Lauterpacht as an academic, Lemkin as a public prosecutor and a commercial lawyer. They came together, although they never met, in 1945 for the Nuremberg trial, when they were retained, respectively, in Lauterpacht's case by the British, in Lemkin's case by the Americans, to prosecute Hans Frank, who had been Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer from 1928 to 1933, and they were charged, respectively, with prosecuting him for crimes against humanity and for genocide. Remarkably, when the trial at Nuremberg began, they did not know that the man they were prosecuting was responsible for the deaths of their entire families. And hence, for me as a litigating lawyer, the idea that you only discover late in the trial that the man who's just sitting a few feet from you is responsible for these issues is of great enormity. But what happened with Nuremberg is it put these two concepts into the law permanently. And of course, today, literally every day, you read about crimes against humanity and genocide. That is one of the legacies of 1945. Of course, it is a legacy which today is under very direct threat because of what is happening on the territory of Ukraine at the instigation of Russia and President Putin and his acolytes. And I just want to take this moment to pay tribute to a very dear friend of mine who died 2 days ago. She was from Lviv. She was a wonderful Ukrainian novelist. She was 37 years old with a 10-year-old son. Her name is Victoria Amelina. And last Tuesday, she went for dinner at a restaurant in Zamatorsk with 3 Colombian friends. And that restaurant was targeted. It was not an accidental strike. It was targeted on purpose with cruise missiles by the Russian authorities intended to frighten civilians. There was no military targets there. It was manifestly a war crime. It was manifestly a crime against humanity. And in the views of Victoria Amelina, who did not survive the attack, it was also a genocide. She and I were together in Lviv last October, debating whether what is going on now in Ukraine is or is not a genocide. I suppose the simple point that I'm making is that the issues that I've chosen to write about, the fact that, you know, on a beautiful evening in July, so many of you are interested in hearing about these subjects, is a theme that resonates in our times very widely, precisely because the 1945 moment, that settlement, is, I think, under great threat right now in terms of recognizing there are limits on what the state can do, recognizing that individuals have rights, and recognizing that those who are members of groups also have rights as members of that group. And that, of course, is a question that affects all of us. Who am I? Question of identity. Am I an individual and am I a member of a group? The answer is we're all members of many different groups. And how do I want the law to protect me? I'll just say one word very briefly about the third book that I've written, which is Die Ratten in Ihr, which takes a different approach, and then just hint at the next one that is coming. In a sense, The Last Colony is an interregnum. Essentially, East-West Street will be the first of a trilogy. The second in the trilogy, The Rat Line, is the story of a single Austrian couple, the Wächters. Otto Wächter was Hans Frank's deputy. And he was the governor first of Krakow and then of Galicia, and he, at the end of the war, was indicted for mass murder, crimes against humanity and genocide. He was never caught. He managed to escape for a few years, holed up in the end in Rome, protected by a single bishop, Alois Hudal, hoping to escape on the Rat Line to South America. He never made it, died in obscure circumstances. Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, and I've come to know Nicholas, and he has become a very dear friend of mine, someone I can say I love as a person, a complex individual, but who wouldn't be complex? I often now ask myself the question, how would I feel to spend my entire adult life having a father who was hanged at Nuremberg for murdering 4 million human beings? How do you live with that? It's not a question I had asked myself because I grew up on the other side of the story. My grandfather, who's also a character in East-West Street, was the only survivor from his family of 80 from Lviv and from Zhilkiev. So for me to meet and get to know and work with Nicholas was a remarkable personal experience, one of the biggest experiences, I think, in my life, I would say. And we've become very close, and our friendship is really testament to the fact that two people who were on very opposite sides of the story in that period in the 1940s, can 75 years later genuinely, truly find reconciliation. This is an extraordinary thing, I think, and a cause for real optimism. Well, one day, Nicholas said to me, Philippe, your family is from Lemberg. Would you like to meet the son of the former governor of Lemberg, my father's deputy, Otto Wächter? I said, yeah, I don't know why he'd want to meet me, but I'm happy to go off and meet him. So one thing led to another. We met, we got on. Horst Wächter, the son, is actually a lovely man, but he takes a completely different view of his father than does Nicholas Frank in relation to his father. The first time I met Nicholas, which was at a wonderful hotel in Hamburg, the Hotel Jakob, sitting on the terrace overlooking the river, Nick said to me, I need to tell you two things, Philippe. Firstly, I need to tell you that I am against the death penalty in every case, except in the case of my father, which for me was quite shocking to hear. And secondly, I need to show you this photograph. And he put his hand in his breast pocket, took out a photograph, and it was the photograph of his father's dead body hanged at Nuremberg. That I had not expected. He despises his father to a level that some people find truly shocking. I understand what he has gone through. Horst is totally different. Horst's father perpetrated exactly the same horrors as Hans Frank, is entirely up to his neck like Hans Frank. But Horst's line on his father is, he didn't want to do it, he's a good man, he was just following orders, he had no option but to do what he did. He would have been killed if he hadn't done it. And so for 10 years I came to know Horst. We don't have the same friendship as I have with Nicholas, but I have a soft spot for him because I think of him as someone who comes from a damaged generation. Both men were born in 1939. He was 6 years old when his father disappeared, when the war came to an end, and he lives with this burden, and this is a huge thing to have lived with. And so we sort of get on, but we have differences of view on his interpretation of his parents. Incidentally, the real main character in the Rat Line is, I think, not Otto Wächter, but the extraordinary Charlotte Wächter, who was a total Nazi, a total racist, totally anti-Semitic, but absolutely loved her husband to bits. And this creates a complexity. Life is not black and white. It's not the case that Hans Frank and Otto Wächter were simply monsters. They were also capable of decency and love and humanity and all these positive sentiments. And that's the real complexity of life. And I understood that Horst, in trying to honor his father, was actually honoring his mother, who loved his father. As he would say, I didn't really know my father, he wasn't around, I never spent much time with him. Otto escapes, Otto tries to get to South America, fails, and the Rat Line tells the story of what happens, essentially, in Rome. While I was researching the archive that Horst gave me, there was a singular moment in my relationship with Nicholas and Horst. I wrote a profile of Horst in 2013 in a major British newspaper, the Financial Times, which came with the title, My Father the Good Nazi. And that was picked up by the BBC and made into a documentary about my relationship with Nicholas and Horst. And we went off together to Lviv, Lemberg, with a BBC crew, and we filmed a documentary there. And Horst was insistent that we go to the region at a particular moment in July. And this was because this was the moment when each year there was an annual celebration of the Waffen SS Galicia division that was created by his father in 1943. And he wanted us to observe the commemoration. So we went. It was a very unhappy day. Actually, it's the reason why Putin is able to say there are lots of Nazis in Ukraine. Actually, there are not lots of Nazis in Ukraine. But the complexity of the story was that a lot of Ukrainians were completely thrilled when the Germans turned up in June 1941 and got rid of, 1, the Red Army, 2, the Poles, and 3, the Jews. And so all of a sudden, the Ukrainians went from being at the bottom of the pile to number 1. And there was a lot of assistance from Ukrainians to the Germans after June 1941, and that is what enables Putin to do so mischievously and so terribly what he's doing. Having spent the day watching hundreds of people in Waffen SS uniforms prancing around a Ukrainian field, not a good day for me, but a fantastic day for Horst von Wächter, who thought it was the best day he'd had in years. Truly, Nicholas was furious and said on camera, Horst is a new kind of Nazi. I don't think Horst is a Nazi, and I said that on camera, but Horst saw that scene. He was incredibly upset, and the upshot of that was that he said to me, Philippe, how can I prove that I'm not a Nazi? This is actually, for anyone here who's a lawyer, there may be lawyers among you, it's very difficult to prove a negative. You know, so I thought about this and I said, well, you've got this archive. You tell me it's 10,000 pages of your family documents. You've only shown me 3 or 4 pages, but if you're not a Nazi, which I don't think you are, why don't you give this to a museum? And then the museum can digitize it and everyone can read it and people can make up their own mind. Nazis don't give those kinds of documents publicly. He said, that's a great idea. I'm not sure he thinks it's such a great idea today. But I introduced him to a wonderful Austrian archivist at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. They came over with 4 digitizers. They spent a week there. They digitized 10,000 pages. And Horst said to me, would you like a copy? So I thought, yeah, why not? 2 weeks later, a single USB stick with 10,000 pages of letters between Charlotte and Otto Wächter from April 1929 when they met until June 1949 when he died, came into my computer. And it was fascinating material. That is the basis for the Ratline book. It is the material which is unique material. I suspect a lot of families, including maybe some families in this room, have in their possession, but has never made it into the public domain. It gives you the minutiae of life at the top table, because they really were the top table. I mean, Wächter's immediate boss was Heinrich Himmler, so you're talking about seriously powerful figures. And that, I think, is why the Ratline has resonated, because it's allowed people to see, completely unvarnished, daily life over that 20-year period. Buried in that correspondence, you've begun to see the themes that come up in the way that I do my books. You know, there's Hans Frank, and then there's a minor character in the Hans Frank story called Otto Wächter. He becomes the major character in the Otto Wächter story. What happens next? In May 1949, in this 10,000 pages of letters, I find one letter that stands out for a number of reasons. Many of the documents are fantastic, but this one letter, this is really interesting. It's sent from Damascus. It's written by one of Otto Wächter's closest comrades. His name is Walter Rauf, and he's living in Damascus, Syria. I remember first time I looked at the letter, 3 pages, single space, typed, of course, in German. I thought, who is this Walter Rauf? So I go onto the internet, and I see that Walter Rauf is not just anybody. Walter Rauf worked for Reinhard Heydrich and Heinrich Himmler in 1941, and he was the inventor and operator of the mobile gas wagons that drove around Central and Eastern Europe, killing people in groups of 50 before they went to industrialized facilities like Belzec and Sobibor and Treblinka. And the letter from Walter Rauf said, my dear comrade, my dear friend, Rauf wrote to him, to Wächter, under his pseudonym, He used a name called Alfredo Reinhardt, not Otto Wächter, my dear Alfredo. The real Alfred Reinhardt, incidentally, had already escaped to Argentina and was living in Salta, although that we only discovered much later. My dear Alfredo, I must advise you not to come to the Arab world. The Arab world is not a good place for us German types. They are too disorganized, they don't work hard enough, and I think you should either head for South Africa or for South America. Wächter never gets there, but I became very curious. This letter piqued my curiosity about Walter Rauff. And he piqued my curiosity for another reason. The way my brain works is I make curious connections. Where do I know this name from? And I realized that I'd seen this name somewhere else, and then it was a friend in Chile who reminded me that Walter Rauff appears in some pretty significant books of literature. He appears as chapter 96 of a wonderful book that's very famous in Britain. I don't know if anyone here will have read it, by an English writer called Bruce Chatwin, called In Patagonia. Right, so some of you know, it's an incredible book. The amazing thing about In Patagonia is it mixes fact with fiction. Chatwin has a tendency to embellish the truth. It's a remarkable book, and all of a sudden, there is Rauff, living in Punta Arenas in southern Chile, featuring in Chatwin's book, published in 1977. And then 20 years later, Rauff appears in not one, but two novels by a remarkable Chilean writer called Roberto Bolaño. He appears in a book called Nights in Chile, where Walter Rauff is renamed Herr Raus, and he becomes the personal teacher of Augusto Pinochet on principles of Marxism. It's a novel. It's a fabulous novel. And then he appears in a second book by Roberto Bolaño called Nazi Literature in the Americas. So Rauff is sort of out there in the ether, and I got all interested. What happened to Rauff? Who was this guy? So I started doing a little bit of research about this Rauff guy, and in a nutshell, just to whet your appetites for what is coming in 2025, Rauff leaves Damascus. No good for Germans. He goes back to Italy. Unbelievably, in Italy, in 1950, he's recruited as an agent by the Israeli intelligence services, whose officer in Rome has no idea what this guy has done. Wanted for mass murder, 970,000 people murdered. He spends 2 years as an agent for the Mossad, or its predecessor. He then leaves with his wife Edith and their 2 boys, Walter Jr. and Alf, and they head for South America and land in Quito, Ecuador, where the inventor and operator of the mobile gas chambers becomes a motor mechanic for Mercedes-Benz in Quito. I mean, honestly, you couldn't invent the stories. As David Cornwell would often say, Philippe, your stories that you come across are more crazy than mine that I invent. He's incredibly happy in Quito, Ecuador, until he and Edith meet an absolutely charming Chilean couple who are based at the Chilean embassy in Quito, who say to the Rauffs, you're in the wrong country. You should be in Chile, because we like people like you in Chile. Go to Chile. And so by 1958, the entire family has gone off to Chile, and Rauff has set up shop in the southernmost town in the world called Punta Arenas. Has anyone here been to Punta Arenas? Yes, great. Okay, that's good. Excellent. And he goes into a new business which is the fish canning business. He becomes a great expert in putting the flesh of crabs into tin cans and exporting it around the world. This begins to be his new life. In 1962, in December, he is arrested in Punta Arenas, pursuant to a request for his extradition to West Germany for mass murder, his work on the mobile gas chambers. His name, most unfortunately for him, has emerged in the context of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the prosecutors in Hanover decide we're going to focus on that guy. They track him down to Punta Arenas. The case goes through the Chilean courts. The Supreme Court of Chile rules in March 1963 that he cannot be extradited because Chile has a 15-year statute of limitations, period. And the crimes for which the extradition has been sought occurred in 1941, 42, which is more than 15 years before the date of the extradition. So he gets off. He goes back to Punta Arenas. He resumes his work as the manager of a fish cannery, makes a good life for himself as a local citizen, is respected, becomes part of local society, is a little bit concerned about these Israelis and Jews who might be after him, including Simon Wiesenthal, but hey, it's in the middle of nowhere. They're never going to find me down here. And life looks good. And then on September the 11th, 1973, life gets even better because, hey presto, his friend from Quito becomes president of Chile. His friend is Augusto Pinochet. You literally could not invent it. And Pinochet apparently, and this is what the book is about, says to him, my dear Walter, I think I need your services. It's time for a second career. And the next book explores what happened between 73 and 77 in Chile, and what happened in London between 1998 and 2000, when Augusto Pinochet, as you know, was arrested for crimes against humanity and genocide, straight linkage with East-West Street, Rückkehr nach Lemberg, for a request for extradition to Spain. And I was one of the lawyers in that case in London, so it becomes very personal. And in this curious way, the third book in the series brings the line that began with Frank and Wächter and then continued with Ralph through into Chile in the 70s, into the English courts in 1998, and into my desk. When I accepted the invitation to go to Lviv, of course, in 2010, when I accepted the invitation to work for the government of Mauritius in relation to the last colony case, I had no idea that this is where it would lead to. So one moral from this story, in a sense, is be wary of what you accept, because you have no idea what it's going to lead to, and one thing inevitably leads to another. But the bottom line, to wrap all of this up, is the thread that runs through all of these stories is, as Jacob kindly put it, issues of international justice, and how we as communities, as people, as countries, struggle with the realities of the system that we have created when faced with particular situations. Let me stop there, and unless I've addressed every question that everyone in this room particularly wants to ask, I'm really happy to take a few questions or have a conversation, just respond to the areas that you're interested in. But thank you so much for your kind attention.
Yes, you wouldn't be surprised that he was also, of course, very sensitive and committed in the context of Guantanamo. So the spectrum is really very broad, and it's, yeah, you should raise questions, if there are any.
There's always one to say. Once one person has asked, then other people always follow.
Sorry.
Please, yeah.
Concerning Chagos, what is the outcome of the process? There was a decision by the court. How was it implemented?
Okay. So the International Court of Justice ruled, in effect, unanimously. There was no dissent on the merits, that what happened in 1965 was illegal, that the United Kingdom had no rights in relation to the Chagos Archipelago, and the Chagos Archipelago has always belonged to Mauritius and belongs to Mauritius today, with the consequences the General Assembly has now decided in May 2019 that all the Chagosians can go back. So what was the response of the United Kingdom to this clear ruling by the International Court of Justice, followed by an even more clear ruling by the Internationale Gerichtshof in Hamburg that Chagos 100% belongs to Mauritius, not the United Kingdom. The British reaction under these fabulous governments we've recently had was to stick two fingers up in the air at international justice and to say, we're going to ignore this, we're going to tough this out, we're going to continue. And that was how it was under the premiership of Theresa May and how it was under the premiership of Boris Johnson. But, unbelievably, I would love to be able to tell you the publication of The Last Colony in September 2022 caused the British government to change position, because it did change position in November 2022, when the British government announced that it was starting negotiations with Mauritius on a settlement of the issue on the basis of international law, which of course means recognition of Mauritian sovereignty over the whole thing. That decision was taken by the shortest British Prime Minister, I think, but one in the history of the United Kingdom, Liz Truss. And I would love to be, no, I know, it's incredible. When I say this in England, people go, you've got to be kidding me. This cannot be right. But it was under Liz Truss's prime ministership. And it would be great to be able to say to you this was a principled decision to do the right thing, respect the rule of law. It had nothing to do with that. Here's why it happened. As you know, in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine and went to war with Ukraine. And many countries, some a little more slowly than others, came to recognize this was a very significant affront for the stability of Europe and the well-being of Europe. I strongly support the strong position taken by the British government in relation to Ukraine. For me, this is existential. I make no bones about it. If Putin is allowed to get away with this, we can just wave goodbye to the order that we thought we had created. It's absolutely existential. Okay. And the reaction of Europe in the end was to come together pretty concretely in that direction. The reaction of the global south has been very different, as you know. I do a lot of work in Africa, in South America, in Asia with governments. And, for example, one African ambassador said to me, it was so interesting, Philippe, the British came to see us to say, we've noticed you're not being as supportive as you could be on our efforts to remove Russia from its illegal occupation of Ukraine. We would like you to assist us. And that African government and others said, that's really interesting. So let's see if we've understood this correctly. You would like us to help you remove Russia from its illegal occupation of Ukraine, whilst at the same time, you are continuing to illegally occupy a part of Africa. Fuck off. That's literally what was said. It's just a total double Western standard, a total hypocrisy. And of course, it's not the only hypocrisy. Iraq is the big elephant in the room. For me, Iraq was manifestly illegal. And now for Britain and the United States to make the arguments that they do, faced with their own manifest illegalities of 20 years ago, is deeply problematic. I mean, we are where we are. I will do what I can for Ukraine. But the upshot of that is that Britain had to change its position in relation to Chagos because it was simply untenable to adopt the position that it was in relation to Russia, whilst at the same time refusing to accept decisions and advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, a binding judgment of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea on Chagos in Africa. So we are now in a negotiation. I'm part of the Mauritian negotiating team, so I can't say very much about it. But I think the word that's used by both governments is very constructive negotiations. So with a bit of luck, this horror story of Chagos, which has been characterized by Human Rights Watch, the NGO, as a crime against humanity. The first time, incidentally, Human Rights Watch has characterized any act by the British or American governments as a crime against humanity. That is new. Will, I think, soon be over, but not for reasons of principle.
Okay. Thank you. You mentioned a couple of times that the Chagosians are black. What role do you think race played and plays in the behavior of the British government towards Chagos over the decades?
Thank you for asking that question. I'd say a total 100% basis. So I've come to know the Chagosian community really well. There's Lisby, who I've mentioned. But in a way, the most significant player for the Chagosians is Lisby's nephew, Olivier Bancou, who's younger than her. He was born in 1964. And he had litigated for years and years and years in the English courts. Not entirely without success. It was his litigation that threw up through the process known as discovery of internal documents from the British government. And it is the documents that litigation threw up that the International Court of Justice relied upon. In other words, what I'm saying is it's the Chagosians, through their actions, who won this case. I mean, they produced the material, the witness testimony of Lisby Elysée, which was absolutely dramatic in the International Court of Justice. 3 minutes and 47 seconds is all she spoke for, and it transformed the entire case. And then we had all the documents that Olivier Bancou had found. I'd known Olivier for 6 or 7 years, and I was just amazed. And one day I said to him, where did you train as a lawyer? He said, where did I train as a lawyer? I'm not a lawyer, I'm an electrician. And it rather proves the point that I began with, that actually anyone can do this law stuff. It's not actually, rocket science. It's pretty straightforward. But to come to your question, we traveled to Chagos in February of last year. It was an extraordinary trip. Mauritius chartered a boat, and a group of 25 people, including 5 Chagosians, including Lisby and Olivier, sailed there. I was very privileged to be on that boat. And when we arrived with the BBC crew and various other journalists, Olivier gave a series of very strong interviews. And he was asked exactly the question that you asked. And he just said, if we had been white, none of this would have happened. Look at how they treated the Falklands, Malvinas, compared to how they treated us. If we had been white and this had happened, they would have rectified it 3 or 4 years later. This is about race. And it's impossible for me to challenge that. It's plainly race has a huge issue. And you see it in the documents. I apologize for what I'm about to say. I've set it out in the book. In 1965, when these decisions were taken by the British government in manifest violation of international law, as they knew, the central question, comes back to your question here, is how did they get away with it? The law in 1965 was already premised on decolonization and something called the right to self-determination. And the resolution of the United Nations that created the right to self-determination, Resolution 1514, said in terms that inherent in the idea of self-determination is the idea that you cannot separate a territory that is being given independence. You cannot dismember a part of it unless you have the consent of the affected population. And so what the British government did on the basis of legal advice from senior lawyers, but some opposed it actually, it's quite interesting, was to say, well, these people who live there, they're not a population. They are contract labourers. They have all been workers there, even if, like Olivier Bancoult, they're 1 year old. They are contract labourers. So we don't have to consult them. It's just outrageous. And then the memos go on to say, they're just Man Fridays. I apologise for the language that I'm using. This is what the documents say. But we can proceed without asking them their opinions. They have no rights. Now, that would not have happened if they were white people. It's just as simple as that. And coming back to where I began, it's one of the reasons, one of the things that has most fascinated me in writing this book is Britain still today is not ready to hear these home truths about the colonial policy it operated not just in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, but still today. I mean, this is in our lifetime. So the racism is still there in the documents from the 1960s, and I'm sorry to say it's there also still in the documents in the early 2000s in relation to this case and the arguments made by Mauritius. So it's a very central question. I'd say coming to this question now, but one other aspect of your question that I think is very important to reflect on is the complexities of a privileged white person from London writing the story of a black woman from the Chagos-Archipelago who can't read or write. And this I've been very sensitive to, as I've had to be very sensitive to it, because there is an issue of appropriation and cultural appropriation, how you deal with this. And I spent a lot of time talking with the Chagosian community, with Lisby, with Olivier, with various friends on how one deals with this. And it's why, in writing the book, I've gone out of my way, as I've agreed with Lisby, that her words are in direct quotations. In other words, she tells her own story. And that comes back to the significance of her testimony at the International Court of Justice. We didn't just want the lawyers standing up and making the arguments about what happened to this community. The judges had to hear from the community itself in their own words. And I suggest you go online, just type in Lisby Elize's statement, ICJ, you will be blown away by the statement. I have never in 35 years of doing cases at the International Court of Justice lived through 3 minutes and 47 seconds like that. It was a transformative moment in the case. And it's one of the reasons I think the book has been bought for a series about Lisby Elize, for a fictionalized series about Lisby Elize. She is a remarkable person.
Okay. Maybe my question is stupid, but it's the first time I learned now today about this law, international law for self-determination of people who want it. How do you look at the desire of the Catalonians to have an independent country, right, and how do you view the European politicians' general policy to oppose it and to stand behind the Spanish government?
Right. So this is a huge question. We could talk about Catalonia, we could talk about Palestine, we could talk about Quebec, we could talk about Scotland. I mean, this is a really huge question. It's not a stupid, it's the very opposite of a stupid question. You know, how do we deal with the realities of the situation? So let me give the example of how this was dealt with in Canada, because it's the same kind of story. In Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada, in the end, decided to apply the question of the conditions under which Quebec could move to independence on the basis of international law, actually on the basis of a wonderful international lawyer, my late, dear, much missed friend James Crawford, who was also very involved in the Chagos case. And that created an argument that was premised on the principle that a part of an existing country can only move away from that country if the country as a whole has authorized it to take a decision to move away. And that was why in the Quebec situation, there was no authorization for Quebec from the Canadian Federal Parliament to have a referendum on whether to move away. Scotland was exactly the same. The UK state gave Scotland the right to have a referendum. A few years ago, that referendum was lost narrowly. Scotland now wants to have another referendum, but Scotland accepts that it can only have a referendum that, if you like, is binding if the state as a whole allows it to do so. And that's also the situation in relation to Spain. Spain has not decided to allow Catalonia to have a referendum to decide whether it wants to leave. Now, this is all premised, of course, on an artifice, the existence of states with boundaries which are artificial, we know this. But that is the way that the international legal order balances the need for stability on the one hand with rights for people on the other. You can see the moment you say any community can move away once it decides to move away from an existing state, you've got total chaos. It's going to happen all over the place. So it's imperfect, but for the time being, that's the rule that we have. It's also the reason, in the context of Chagos, that the group that decides on the future of the Chagos archipelago is not the Chagosians. It's all Mauritians, because all Mauritians have a legal interest in the integrity or not of their country. So there are some Chagosians who would like Chagos to be an independent country with a population of 1,000 people. But Chagos can't do that unless the government of Mauritius authorizes it to do that. That's the way that it works.
Yeah, I've got two questions for you about Chagos. But first, maybe I could very briefly mention something to your question. You've already answered it. I wanted to add Margaret Thatcher, she supported the white people in the Falklands with a war. And interestingly, just before the war started, she said, "These are sovereign British people." And she never would have said that about the Chagosians because they're poor black people. And as you have already also mentioned, they've all been exported, expelled, and they have been living in slum conditions near the capital in Mauritius for years and years. And it is very sad. Maybe I'll try and be very brief and say I've read very terrible, horrific things about British history, British colonialism. But when I started reading years ago about Chagos, I wasn't shocked at all. I was disgusted, yes, but I wasn't shocked because it is so typical. I've argued with other Londoners, British, and sometimes they would say, "Johnny, where have you read that? I've never read that. Where have you read these bad things about Britain? We've been civilising, we've been building railways." And it's awful, actually, that so many British people don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear about their own colonialism. More interestingly, also, as with Philippe Sands, I've been to the Chagos, and it is absolute paradise. Perhaps you could, actually, geographically, you could say it's Maldives. There's quite a big gap in the Indian Ocean, but it's very similar in the sense you can imagine a beautiful blue lagoon, Peros, Banos and Salomon. They're much smaller than the American base on Diego Garcia, but it is paradise, and it is no wonder these people want to go back there. Their houses are still there. Unfortunately, all their little fishing boats have been stolen.
But they are going to go back.
Yeah.
That's now in train. I just just want to say, if I can just react in relation to what you said about our own sense of history. So I was very troubled when the Prime Minister of Mauritius called me on that ski trip. I'd heard of Diego Garcia, but frankly, I didn't know about Chagos. So I read myself in, and then I asked myself, how could it be that I have never really focused on this story, that I was unaware of it? And I went back to my own education. I went back to my own school textbook, which, you know, I'm sort of a hoarder, and I found it. It was published in 1967. We studied, you know, this in 72, 73, when we were 12, 13. And it was a book by a writer called Geoffrey Treece, This Is Your Century. And chapter 16 or something like that was called Sunset on Empire. And Sunset on Empire basically told us kids about the greatness of, exactly as you've been saying, of the United Kingdom, the railways and everything. But it had, I was really shocked reading it. It was really shocking. But it explains why someone from my generation has just not engaged with these issues. And the last colony in the case has been a real wake-up call for me, a really radicalizing experience, as you will, I'm sure, in part have picked up. So Sunset on Empire, the chapter that Geoffrey Treece wrote, includes a comparison between two men, the magnificent Viscount Mountbatten, the last governor of India, resplendent, tall, elegant, meat-eating, hats, feathers, empire, brilliant, compared to the new bloke, short, pacifist, vegetarian, and, again, I apologize for what I'm about to say, but it's in my school book, looks a bit like a monkey wearing glasses. Mahatma Gandhi. That's what we read at school. I mean, you know, it's shocking. It's really shocking. So is it any surprise that a whole generation of Brits just never engaged properly with these issues, and I think still are having trouble properly engaging with these issues? There's one point, we're probably running out of time, but just to wrap up on an interesting point of comparison. Something happened a year and a half, 2 years ago, in relation to the German relationship to its responsibilities for a place known as German Southwest Africa, today Namibia. And two things have happened. The German government has recognized that what happened in 1908 is properly to be characterized as a genocide. Now, what's really interesting about that is the term genocide, as I explained at the beginning, was only invented in November 1944. It did not exist in 1908. So what the German government is effectively doing is retroactively applying a 1944 concept to something that happened in 1908. Well, if you can do that to something that happened in 1908, why can't you do it to things that happened in 1808 or 1708? And what Germany has effectively done is opened the door to an engagement with matters of a historic nature, but which have continuing consequences today. Germany has also offered Namibia, the government and the people, about €1 billion in development assistance, but Namibia has not yet accepted it because Namibia wishes it to be characterized as a reparation for a wrong done. The German government is concerned, and I can understand their concern, that once you open that door, it would effectively be the first time reparation for a long ago wrong is paid. You risk opening the floodgates. But I'd invite you to compare Germany's engagement with its colonial past with Britain's engagement with its colonial past, where these kinds of acts of recognition or even financial support, however characterized, has not happened and is not about to happen. So the issue of how a community grapples with the sins of its past is very live. It's a changing moment, I think. And I suspect that at some point the floodgates are going to open, and we're going to be talking a lot more about these historic wrongs. And it's in that context that Chagos is so incredibly important. Because what the International Court of Justice did in its advisory opinion of February 2019 is to say absolutely clearly this was a wrong and it has to be repaired. And Britain didn't expect that, and the United States didn't expect that, and they're having trouble coming to terms with it. So it's a very interesting moment that we are living in.
While we're discussing here, we see headlines in the Near East. Have you ever been approached by Palestinians as in terms of international law?
There is an advisory opinion now before the International Court of Justice. When we argued the case for Mauritius at the International Court of Justice on Palestine, we said to the court, this case is totally unique. You do not need to worry at all that if you do justice for Mauritius and the Chagosians, the floodgates will open. We knew that was not entirely likely to be the case. And 2 years later, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted a resolution, just now in December, requesting an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, not on self-determination in Mauritius, but on self-determination in relation to Palestine. And that case is now before the International Court of Justice and will be argued over the next year, and there will be hearings probably in March or April of 2024 on the rights of self-determination of the Palestinian people. And I'm one of the counsel for Palestine in that case. So the answer is yes.
Final question.
Excuse me, I hope not to abuse your patience. Two questions, very short. First one, you said the Chagosians do not have a right on their own to become independent. They were bound together by colonialism. So you could question if it's right that they don't have their own right, because it's just a confirmation of colonialism. And the second question, what about the Falklands or Malvinas? Thank you.
So the Chagosian community was about 2,000 people in between 65 and 73. They were all physically removed. They were sent to Mauritius, Seychelles, and the United Kingdom. And of course, that community has now grown because there's a second generation, a third generation, a fourth generation. So there's now several thousand people who identify as Chagosians. And I have to say, and I should have said this earlier, the Chagosians themselves are very, very divided about the future. The Chagosians living in Mauritius see Mauritius as the only way forward. The Chagosians living in the United Kingdom are not happy with the decision of the International Court of Justice, to speak very frankly, and would like to remain part of the United Kingdom. That ship has sailed, that's not going to happen. And there's another group of Chagosians who say, you know, we don't want to be British, we don't want to be Mauritian, we just want to be Chagosian. So the community, perfectly as they're entitled to do, members express very different views on what they want. But the position under international law is really clear. Because of the historical accident that Chagos was part of the British colony of Mauritius in 1965, the way international law works is to give priority to Mauritius, and it is for Mauritius to determine whether Chagos will or will not continue to be part of its territory. And the view of the Mauritian majority is, having spent 15 years or 50 years on this, we're not about to hand over the Chagos-Archipelago. So you can argue as to the rights and the wrongs of that view, but that view is grounded in the international legal order as it is today. But the point that you raise is an important one, and I think one's got to be very sensitive to different members of the Chagosian community. The issue between Chagos and the Falklands Malvinas is different, because the Falklands Malvinas never was part of another British colony which was then cut off. So it's a very different story. And the question of self-determination in relation to the Malvinas Falklands, is also to be seen in relation to the question of the acquisition of territory under international law and the dispute between the United Kingdom and Argentina as to the circumstances of who discovered it, who occupied it, and blah, 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 and so on and so forth. But one of the things I mentioned in the book, after the International Court of Justice had given its advisory opinion in February 2019, the matter went to the General Assembly of the UN. The General Assembly then adopted a resolution which the United Kingdom and the United States lost overwhelmingly. It was 116 votes to support and implement the advisory opinion, which is binding on the UN, and only 4 countries in the world supported the United Kingdom and the United States in opposing that resolution. They were Australia, Hungary, the Maldives, and Israel. And what happened after a vote is that what always happens is countries can give an explanation of vote. And I describe it in the book. It was quite distressing, I have to say. The British ambassador, the permanent representative to the UN, reading from a piece of paper, so I think she was told what she had to say, made an explanation of vote, and she said, the United Kingdom remains firmly committed to the right of self-determination in international law, pause, for the people of the Falkland Islands. And I think what a lot of people in the room heard, coming back to the question that was asked before, it's one rule for the whites and another rule for the blacks. It was a very unfortunate thing to say. It did not go down well at the UN. People at the UN, ambassadors, they're pretty smart, savvy characters. They knew what was being said. It was a very unfortunate moment. And it's one of the reasons why I say the issue of race is not a 1960s issue or an 1860s issue. It's still an issue today. In 2019, in the explanation of vote at the General Assembly, frankly, the issue of race was there explicitly enough for many people in the room to hear what the permanent representative was saying. It was extremely unfortunate.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
What is Israel's reasoning in this thing? That's just
well, I mean, Israel's concern with this whole issue, of course, would be the right of return. Yeah. And, you know, the court, in its advisory opinion, didn't say anything about the right of return of the Chagosians. The questions that were put to the court, there were 2 questions. The first question was the decolonization of Mauritius completed in 1968 when Mauritius got independence? And secondly, if not, what are the legal consequences today? And what the court said, decolonization was not lawfully completed because a part of the territory of Mauritius, the Chagos Archipelago, was unlawfully removed. And 2, the United Kingdom must bring this illegal situation to an end forthwith. And the General Assembly of the UN said forthwith means by November 2019. So the court didn't actually have to say, and there's a right of return for the Chagosians to go back, because that was implicit in what they were saying and the right of Mauritius to decide. And Mauritius's position is the Chagosians who want to go back can go back, whatever nationality they have, whoever they are, wherever they are. But when the matter went to the General Assembly said explicitly the Chagosians have the right to return. So the consequences of this decision are pretty significant. It's not said explicitly, but implicitly, the court is basically saying the right of self-determination means, 1, you can't chop off bits of a country's territory, and 2, if you do and it's found to be illegal, the people who've been removed from that territory will be able to go back. So that, I think, answers your question. It opens the door to what's coming in relation to other parts of the world.
So, beyond international law, you have heard stories and stories, incredibly fascinating and thrilling. look into one of these books. They'll keep you, at least for the summer vacation, thrilled. So you have the chance to get it signed, and I think there is a lot of pleasure, intellectual pleasure ahead. Thank you very much.